On the morning of January 24th, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall was inspecting a mill race at Sutter's Mill on the American River, in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada in California, when he noticed something glinting in the water at his feet. He picked it up. It was soft enough to bend between his fingers. It was heavy for its size. He showed it to John Sutter, the Swiss entrepreneur who owned the mill and the land around it, and Sutter confirmed what Marshall suspected. It was gold. Sutter tried to keep it quiet. He understood, with the instinct of a man who had spent years building something fragile in a remote place, that the discovery would destroy everything he had constructed. He was correct. Within months, his workers had abandoned the mill and his fields to search for gold. Within a year, his cattle had been slaughtered by squatters, his crops left to rot, his land overrun by tens of thousands of people who recognized no claim he had to any of it. By 1852, John Sutter was effectively ruined. The man on whose land the discovery was made reduced to poverty by the consequences of that discovery. The news traveled slowly at first. California, in January of 1848, was a remote place. Recently acquired from Mexico through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed 9 days after Marshall's discovery, connected to the eastern United States by sea routes that took months and by overland trails that were impassable in winter. The local California newspapers reported the discovery in March of 1848, but the reports were initially met with skepticism in the East. Gold discoveries had been announced before and had come to nothing. The men who read about California gold in New York or Boston in the spring of 1848 had no particular reason to believe this one was different. What changed everything was Samuel Brannan. Brannan was a San Francisco merchant and newspaper publisher who had, crucially, stocked his stores with mining supplies before making the announcement that would change his fortunes and everyone else's. In May of 1848, he walked through the streets of San Francisco holding a bottle of gold dust above his head and shouting that gold had been found on the American River. San Francisco, a settlement of roughly 1,000 people at the time, emptied within days. Businesses closed. Ships in the harbor were abandoned by their crews. The first wave of California gold seekers were Californians themselves, Mexicans, Californios, native Californians, and the small American and European population already in the territory, who arrived at the diggings before the rest of the world understood what was happening. President James Polk confirmed the discovery in his address to Congress in December of 1848, and the confirmation by the President of the United States transformed skepticism into certainty. By the spring of 1849, the movement was underway on a scale that had no precedent in the history of voluntary human migration. In a single year, approximately 90,000 people traveled to California. The men who made this journey in 1849 became known as the 49ers, a name that attached itself to the entire gold rush era, and that has endured in American culture as a symbol of a specific combination of ambition, recklessness, and hope. The people who came to California in 1849 and the years that followed were not the homogeneous group of American mythology. They came from everywhere. Americans from the eastern states and the Midwest made up the largest single national group, but they were accompanied by Mexicans, Chileans, Peruvians, Australians, Chinese, French, Germans, Irish, Italians, and people from dozens of other countries who had heard the same news and made the same calculation. The California Gold Rush was the first event in American history to draw significant immigration from Asia, specifically from the Guangdong province of southern China, where economic hardship and political instability had created a population willing to make a journey of 12,000 kilometers on the possibility of finding wealth in a place they called Gamsan, Gold Mountain. The journey to California was itself a serious undertaking that claimed lives before anyone reached a mining camp. there were three primary routes. The overland route followed the established trails west, the California Trail branching from the Oregon Trail in present-day Idaho and crossing the Sierra Nevada through passes that were closed by snow from October through May. The sea route around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America took between 5 and 8 months by sailing ship and exposed travelers to storms, disease, and the psychological torture of months at sea in cramped and unsanitary conditions. The Panama route, which became increasingly popular as the gold rush progressed, involved sailing to the Caribbean coast of Panama, crossing the 50-kilometer isthmus by river and on foot through jungle terrain, and then catching another ship up the Pacific coast to San Francisco. The Panama crossing exposed travelers to cholera and yellow fever in some of the deadliest disease environments in the Western Hemisphere. The overland route in 1849 was the fastest option for those departing from the Missouri River, but fast was a relative term. The journey from Independence, Missouri to the gold fields of California was approximately 3,000 kilometers and took between 4 and 6 months under good conditions. The 49ers who traveled this route did so under conditions that were more crowded and more dangerous than earlier trail travelers had experienced, because the sheer volume of people and animals moving along the same corridor consumed water and grass faster than they could recover. Water sources that had been reliable in previous years were fouled by the passage of thousands of animals and people. Grass was grazed down to bare earth by the livestock of the people ahead of you. Cholera moved through the wagon trains in waves that could kill dozens of people in a single day. The men and women who survived the journey and arrived in California in 1849 found conditions that bore almost no resemblance to the California of their imagination. The mining camps that had sprung up along the rivers and creeks of the Sierra Nevada foothills were places of extraordinary physical hardship. Housing was whatever could be constructed quickly from available materials: canvas tents, rough board shelters, holes dug into hillsides and covered with branches. Food was expensive, scarce, and often of poor quality. A pound of flour that cost a few cents in Missouri cost $1 or more in the mining camps. Eggs cost $1 each. Boots, which wore out quickly in the rocky creek beds where miners spent their days, cost enormous sums and were not always available at any price. The physical work of placer mining, which was the primary technique in the early years of the gold rush, involved standing in cold mountain water for hours at a time, often from before dawn until after dark, moving gravel and sediment through a pan or a series of sluices to separate the heavy gold from the lighter rock. The Sierra Nevada rivers and streams ran cold even in summer, fed by snowmelt from the mountains above. A man who spent his days in that water, in wet clothing, eating inadequate food, sleeping in a damp tent, was a man whose body was under constant physiological stress. Rheumatism, respiratory infections, dysentery, and scurvy were endemic in the mining camps. The death rate from disease was significantly higher than the death rate from violence, although violence was common enough to require mention. The technology of gold extraction evolved rapidly in response to the pace at which surface deposits were exhausted. The gold pan was the simplest tool, a shallow metal dish used to swirl water and sediment until the gold settled at the bottom. It was effective but slow, processing perhaps 50 pans of material per day for a single miner. The rocker, also called the cradle, was a wooden box mounted on curved runners that could be rocked back and forth by one man while another shoveled material into it, increasing throughput significantly. The long tom was a longer trough with riffles on the bottom to catch gold, requiring a steady water supply and the labor of several men, but processing much larger volumes of material. The sluice box extended this principle further, a long wooden channel through which water and gravel were continuously fed, the riffles catching the gold as the lighter material was washed away. By 1852, The easily accessible surface gold that could be recovered by individual miners with simple equipment was substantially depleted in most areas. The deposits that remained required more capital, more organization, and more destructive techniques to access. Hydraulic mining, which used powerful water jets to blast entire hillsides into slurry that was then processed for gold, became the dominant technique in California by the mid-1850s. The water pressure required for hydraulic mining was generated by elaborate systems of ditches, flumes, and pipes that brought water from high mountain reservoirs to the mining sites, engineering works that required significant capital investment, and that transformed the landscape on a scale that individual pan miners could never have achieved. The hills of the Sierra Nevada foothills were literally washed away. Rivers ran brown with sediment for months after each season of hydraulic mining. The downstream agricultural valleys, which had begun to develop as the gold rush created a market for food, were repeatedly flooded with mining debris that covered fields and destroyed crops. The social organization of the mining camps was improvised and unstable. In the earliest period, before any formal legal structure had been established, the camps governed themselves through informal agreements and through the threat of collective violence against those who violated the norms of the community. Claim jumping, the taking of another miner's established claim, was the most serious offense against the mining community's economic interests, and it was punished with a severity that the formal legal system, once it arrived, would not have sanctioned. Whipping, banishment from the camp, and hanging were all recorded responses to claim jumping in the early years. The racial hierarchy of the mining camps was established quickly and maintained through a combination of law, economic pressure, and direct violence. White American miners, who formed the largest and most politically connected group, systematically excluded or disadvantaged miners of other origins. The foreign miners' tax, passed by the California legislature in 1850, imposed a monthly fee of $20 on all foreign-born miners, a sum that was prohibitive for most miners and that was enforced selectively against Chinese, Mexican, and South American miners rather than against European immigrants. The tax drove many Chilean and Mexican miners from the fields entirely. Chinese miners, who tended to work claims that white miners had already abandoned as unprofitable, were subjected to the tax even when working marginal claims that produced barely enough to cover it. The violence directed against Chinese miners was systematic and severe. Chinese camps were raided and burned. Chinese miners were beaten, robbed, and killed with a regularity that the formal legal system made almost no effort to address, because Chinese residents could not testify in court against white defendants under California law. The legal exclusion of Chinese testimony meant that crimes against Chinese people were effectively immune from prosecution as long as no white witness was willing to testify, which was rarely the case. The result was a community of approximately 25,000 Chinese miners by 1852 who had almost no recourse against the violence directed at them except to cluster together in large enough groups to deter individual attacks and to work the claims in the most remote and least desirable locations where the competition from white miners was least intense. The treatment of California's indigenous population during the gold rush decade was catastrophic. Before American conquest, California had one of the highest concentrations of indigenous people anywhere in North America, with estimates ranging from 150,000 to 300,000 people, organized into hundreds of distinct tribal groups. The gold rush brought into California a population that viewed indigenous people as obstacles to resource extraction, competitors for land and food, and threats to settlement. The California state government actively funded and organized military expeditions against indigenous communities, reimbursing local militias for the costs of campaigns that resulted in the killing of indigenous people. Governor Peter Burnett declared in his 1851 state address that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. This was not a prediction. It was a policy statement. Between 1848 and 1860, the indigenous population of California fell from an estimated 150,000 to approximately 30,000. The causes were disease, which continued its centuries-long work of reducing populations with no immunity to European pathogens. They were starvation, as the game and plant resources that indigenous communities depended on were destroyed or monopolized by the incoming population. And they were direct violence, including organized massacres, that killed thousands of people in events that were documented at the time, but that received almost no legal or political response. The scale of death in this period qualifies, by modern standards of definition, as genocide, and it has been recognized as such by the state of California in official declarations made in the 21st century. The city of San Francisco grew with a speed that had no precedent in urban history. In 1848, it was a small settlement of perhaps 1,000 people. By 1850, its population was 25,000. By 1855, it was 50,000, making it the largest city on the Pacific coast of North America and one of the most economically significant ports in the world. The growth was not orderly. The hills of San Francisco were covered with buildings constructed of whatever materials were available, and the city burned repeatedly. 6 major fires between 1849 and 1851, each one destroying large sections of the built environment, and each one followed by reconstruction that was slightly more substantial than what had come before. The people who became wealthy from the California gold rush were, with some exceptions, not the miners. The miners were wage laborers in the most brutal sense, trading their physical health for the possibility of wealth that the majority never achieved. The average miner in California between 1848 and 1855 earned approximately the same daily wage as a laborer in the eastern United States, and he spent most of what he earned on the inflated prices of food, equipment, and shelter in the mining camps. Some miners struck it rich. The stories of the men who did were told and retold because they confirmed the narrative that justified the suffering of everyone else. The men who consistently profited from the gold rush were the merchants, the landlords, the lawyers, the bankers, and the suppliers who provided the miners with what they needed and collected a portion of whatever the miners found. Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco from New York in 1853, intending to sell dry goods to miners. He ended up manufacturing denim work pants reinforced with copper rivets at stress points, designed for the physical demands of mining work. The pants sold. Samuel Brannan, who had been first to announce the gold discovery in the streets of San Francisco, had already stocked his stores with mining supplies. He became the wealthiest man in California, not by mining, but by selling to miners at prices that reflected their desperate need for supplies they could not obtain elsewhere. Philip Armour made his first significant capital in the California gold rush, selling meat to miners, and used it to build the meatpacking empire that would dominate the Chicago market for decades. The banking and finance infrastructure that emerged from the gold rush established San Francisco as the financial center of the American West for the next century. The need to assay gold, transfer it to Eastern banks, and provide credit to the mining industry created the conditions for financial institutions to establish themselves and to thrive. Wells Fargo, founded in 1852, began as an express and banking service for the gold rush economy and built the network of offices, stagecoach routes, and financial relationships that would sustain it as the dominant financial institution of the western United States. The gold rush transformed California's relationship with the rest of the country in ways that had permanent political consequences. California applied for statehood in 1850 and was admitted to the Union as a free state, which meant it prohibited slavery. This admission, negotiated as part of the Compromise of 1850, was bitterly contested by the slave states, which saw the addition of another free state as a further shift in the balance of power in the Senate away from the slaveholding South. The California question was one of the threads that, pulling steadily through the 1850s, would eventually unravel the political compromise that held the Union together and precipitate the Civil War. The Chinese community that the gold rush brought to California established roots that would prove difficult to destroy despite the sustained legal and social effort to destroy them. Chinese immigrants built the laundries, restaurants, and domestic service businesses that the mining economy needed. They built the roads and later the railroad that the expanding California economy required. They established the agricultural systems that would make California one of the most productive farming regions in the world. And they established communities, particularly in San Francisco's Chinatown, that persisted through decades of legal exclusion, racial violence, and official hostility, surviving the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906, and the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II to become the oldest Chinatown in North America. The physical landscape of the Sierra Nevada foothills was permanently altered by the decade of intensive mining that followed Marshall's discovery. Hydraulic mining removed entire hillsides. Rivers were redirected through wooden flumes to allow the mining of their original beds. Mercury, used in large quantities to amalgamate gold from ore, was released into the watershed in amounts that contaminated rivers and estuaries far downstream. The debris from hydraulic mining operations accumulated in the rivers and raised their beds by several meters in some locations, causing the flooding of agricultural land in the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys that eventually led to the Sawyer decision of 1884, a federal court ruling that prohibited hydraulic mining operations from dumping their tailings into the waterways. It was one of the first significant environmental regulations in American history, issued not out of concern for the environment in any modern sense, but out of the economic interests of the farmers downstream whose land was being destroyed. By 1858, the California gold rush in its classic form was effectively over. The easily accessible placer deposits were exhausted. The individual miner with a pan and a rocker could no longer expect to find enough gold to justify the cost of living in the mining camps. The population of the Sierra Nevada mining regions began to decline as miners moved on to new discoveries: Nevada silver in 1859, Colorado gold in the same year, and eventually to the series of mining rushes that would continue across the American West for the next 3 decades. California's economy began the transition from mining to agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing that would define it for the rest of the 19th century and beyond. The legacy of the California gold rush operated on multiple levels simultaneously. It established California as a populous and economically significant state within 2 years of American acquisition, a speed of development that no territory in American history had previously achieved. It built the financial and commercial infrastructure of the Pacific Coast. It drew immigration from Asia that permanently altered the demographic character of the American West. It destroyed indigenous California with a thoroughness that the mission system of the Spanish colonial period, brutal as it was, had not achieved. It demonstrated that the American economic system could mobilize vast numbers of people and enormous quantities of capital in response to resource discovery, and that it would do so without significant regard for the environmental, social, or human costs of that mobilization. The 49ers themselves, the men and women who made the journey to California in the decade between 1848 and 1858, were people operating under the same economic and social pressures that the system they lived in created. Most of them did not become wealthy. Most of them experienced hardship, disease, and disappointment. Some of them participated in violence against Chinese miners and indigenous Californians. Most of them simply worked and struggled, and either found enough to justify the journey or did not. They were not heroes or villains in any simple sense. They were people responding to the greatest wealth discovery in the history of the continent with the tools and values and limitations of the society that had produced them. What they built and what they destroyed and what they set in motion shaped the American West and the American character in ways that are still visible. The California of today, the most populous state in the Union, the fifth largest economy in the world, the center of the technology industry that has reshaped global civilization in the 21st century, is the direct descendant of the decade that began on a January morning in 1848, when a carpenter looked down at something glinting in the water of the American River and changed the world. The winter of 1848 to 1849 was the last quiet season California would experience for a decade. The men who had arrived in 1848 had staked the most accessible claims along the main branches of the American River and its tributaries, the North Fork, the Middle Fork, the South Fork, and along the Feather River, the Yuba, the Bear, and dozens of smaller creeks that drained the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada. They had taken perhaps $10 million worth of gold from the California streams in that first year, a figure that represented more placer gold recovered in a single year than any previous mining operation in history. And they had barely begun. The geography of the gold country was not arbitrary. The gold that 49ers found in the river gravels and creek beds of the Sierra Nevada foothills had been deposited there by millions of years of geological processes. The original source was quartz veins embedded in the granite of the Sierra Nevada, formed when superheated mineral-rich water was forced into cracks in the rock during the mountain-building processes of the distant geological past. Over millions of years, erosion had broken down the quartz and carried the gold particles downhill into the rivers, where the density of gold caused it to settle in predictable locations, on the downstream side of boulders, in the bends of rivers where currents slowed, in bedrock crevices where the weight of the metal caused it to sink below the gravel. A miner who understood this geology, who could read the river and the gravel bars and the exposed bedrock, had a significant advantage over one who simply dug randomly. The best miners were not the strongest or the most reckless. They were the most observant. The question of law in the mining camps was not simply a question of the absence of law. It was a question of whose law applied and to whose benefit. The formal American legal system arrived in California with statehood in 1850, but its application in the remote mining districts was irregular and often delayed by the sheer distances involved and the difficulty of convening courts in places where the population moved constantly in pursuit of new strikes. In the interim, the mining camps developed their own regulatory systems, the mining district rules, which established the size of claims a single miner could hold, the methods by which claims could be established and recorded, and the procedures for resolving disputes between claimants. These rules were created by the miners themselves in public meetings and were enforced by the community. They were in some respects remarkably democratic, applying the same standards to all participants regardless of wealth or social status, as long as those participants were white. The mining district rules almost universally excluded Chinese, Mexican, and indigenous miners from their protections while subjecting them to their restrictions, a double exclusion that captured the essential character of the gold rush legal order. The rules protected the property rights of white miners while denying the same protections to everyone else. The alcalde system inherited from Mexican California provided a form of local governance in the immediate post-conquest period, combining the functions of mayor, judge, and chief administrator in a single elected official. The alcaldes of the mining districts dealt with the full range of human conflict that concentrated populations of stressed, hopeful, disappointed, and sometimes desperate men produced. Assault, theft, fraud, and the various forms of dispute that arose from conflicting claims to the same piece of ground all came before the alcaldes, who resolved them with the authority and the resources available, which were often limited and sometimes non-existent. Justice in the mining camps was swift when it was applied, brutal when the community decided the situation warranted brutality, and absent when the victim was Chinese or indigenous. The women who came to California during the gold rush occupied a specific and complicated position in the social landscape of the camps. They were dramatically outnumbered. In 1850, women constituted perhaps 8% of California's non-indigenous population, and in the mining districts the proportion was even lower. This scarcity gave women who were present in the camps economic opportunities that did not exist in the more gender-balanced society of the eastern United States. Laundry, cooking, boarding house operation, and the provision of domestic services that men in the camps were unable to provide for themselves commanded prices that reflected the fundamental economics of supply and demand. A woman who ran a boarding house or a laundry in a mining camp in 1850 could earn more than most miners. The domestic economy of the mining camps was one of the most overlooked aspects of the gold rush economy. Someone had to cook the food, wash the clothing, nurse the sick, and provide the basic services that sustained human life in difficult conditions. This labor was performed primarily by women and by Chinese men who had entered the domestic service economy because racial exclusion from the mining claims had forced them to find other ways to earn a living. The intersection of gender and racial exclusion in determining who performed the invisible labor of the gold rush camps is a history that has been consistently underwritten in favor of the more dramatic narrative of men with pans standing in rivers. The environmental consequences of the gold rush extended far beyond the immediate mining districts. The demand for lumber to build the flumes, sluice boxes, mine supports, and buildings of the gold rush economy stripped the forests of the Sierra Nevada foothills at a pace that left hillsides bare and vulnerable to erosion. The demand for food created the conditions for intensive agriculture in the Sacramento Valley and the coastal regions of California, driving the rapid conversion of native grassland and wetland to farmland. The introduction of non-native plant and animal species, carried inadvertently in the grain, hay, and livestock that fed the mining population, began the transformation of California's native ecosystems that continues to the present day. The California that existed in 1848, its native plants, native animals, native waterways, and native peoples, was altered more profoundly in the decade that followed than it had been in the previous century of Spanish and Mexican presence. The communication infrastructure that the gold rush created laid the foundation for the information economy of the American West. The demand for news from California was insatiable in the eastern states. People who had sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers in the mining camps wanted to know what was happening there. Newspapers in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia covered California with a thoroughness previously reserved for European capitals. The Alta California, founded in San Francisco in 1849, became the most widely read newspaper on the Pacific Coast, and the primary vehicle through which the 49ers made sense of their own experience and communicated it to the world. Mark Twain, who arrived in California in the early 1860s after the peak of the rush, learned his craft as a journalist in this environment, and the irreverent, skeptical, democratic voice that would define American literature in the late 19th century was shaped in part by the culture the gold rush had created.